Sarah Morgan wiped the sweat from her brow as the late summer sun cast long shadows across her father's ranch in Montana. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she watched Shadow, her black stallion, pacing restlessly near the fence line. There was something different about his behavior today, a nervous energy that made her pause between tasks to study his movements more carefully. The ranch had been quiet since her father's passing last spring, leaving Sarah to manage the sprawling property alone. At 32, she'd grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in the rhythmic routine of ranch life and the steady companionship of Shadow. The horse had been her father's last gift to her, a proud creature with an intuition that sometimes seemed almost human. As dusk approached, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Shadow's agitation increased, his hooves striking the packed earth with growing urgency. His dark eyes kept returning to the old service road that ran past the property, near the county landfill that had been a source of contention among local landowners for years. "What's got into you, boy?" Sarah murmured, approaching the fence. Shadow's ears twitched at her voice, but his attention remained fixed on something beyond her perception. The last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, while thick clouds gathered overhead, bringing an early darkness to the valley. The first drops of rain began to fall as Sarah finished her evening chores, the gentle patter growing steadily stronger against the barn's metal roof. Shadow's behavior had become increasingly erratic, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an almost frantic energy. He paced the length of his enclosure, stopping occasionally to throw his head back and release a shrill whinny that seemed to pierce the gathering gloom. It was well past midnight when Sarah bolted awake in her bed, instantly alert. Something had changed in the symphony of night sounds. Shadow's distressed calls cut through the steady drumming of rain. She pulled on her boots and grabbed a flashlight, her heart racing as she hurried to the barn. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Shadow's stall was empty, the gate hanging open. In the distance, she could just make out his dark form moving through the rain, heading toward the service road and the landfill beyond. "Shadow," she called out, but her voice was lost in the wind that had begun to howl through the valley. Without hesitation, Sarah ran to her truck, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly across the muddy ground. The rain had intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead of her vehicle as she followed the road toward the landfill. She found Shadow standing motionless at the edge of the dump site, his coat gleaming wet in the truck's headlights. As Sarah approached, she could hear something else beneath the sound of rain and wind, a faint, mewling cry that seemed to come from the piles of garbage before them. Shadow's ears were pricked forward, his whole body tense as he focused on a particular spot among the refuse. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that would forever change her life. A cardboard box, partially protected from the rain by an overhanging piece of corrugated metal, and from within it, the unmistakable sound of an infant's cry. Her hands trembled as she approached, Shadow moving protectively beside her. The box was wedged between two garbage bags, as if someone had tried to conceal it from casual observation. As she drew closer, the cry grew stronger, a desperate plea that cut straight to her heart. Sarah dropped to her knees in the mud, heedless of the rain that now poured down her back. With shaking hands, she pulled back the soaked cardboard flaps. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be a dirty towel, lay a newborn baby, its skin tinged blue from cold, its cries growing weaker by the moment. "Oh my God," she whispered, immediately shrugging off her jacket to wrap around the infant. Shadow nickered softly, his warm breath ghosting over her shoulder as she cradled the tiny form against her chest. The baby couldn't have been more than a few hours old. The umbilical cord had been roughly cut, and traces of birth still clung to its delicate skin. Lightning split the sky as Sarah ran back to her truck, Shadow following close behind. Her mind raced with questions, but the immediate need was clear. This child needed warmth and medical attention. She cranked up the heat in the truck's cab, holding the baby close as she fumbled for her phone with one hand. The voice of Sheriff Tom Wheeler answered on the third ring, gruff with sleep but immediately alert when Sarah explained what she'd found. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "I'm calling an ambulance and heading your way now." But Sarah couldn't wait. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers, its tiny body shivering despite the heat blasting from the vents. "I'm taking it home," she told Tom. "Send everyone there. I've got to get this little one warm now." The drive back to the ranch seemed to take an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Shadow kept pace with the truck the entire way, his powerful form visible in the headlights as he galloped through the rain. Sarah spoke continuously to the baby, her voice cracking with emotion as she promised over and over that everything would be all right. Inside the ranch house, Sarah's emergency medical training from her years as a volunteer firefighter took over. She grabbed clean towels and blankets, gently drying the infant while keeping it close to her body for warmth. The baby was a girl, she discovered, tiny but perfect, with a shock of dark hair plastered to her head. As Sarah worked, Shadow took up position outside the kitchen window, his watchful gaze scanning the darkness beyond. There was something in his posture that suggested his vigil wasn't over, as if he sensed there was more to this night's revelations than they'd yet discovered. The sound of sirens in the distance brought both relief and anxiety. Sarah knew that once the authorities arrived, the baby would be taken away, launched into a system that, despite its best intentions, often failed the most vulnerable. As she held the now quieting infant, watching some color return to her tiny features, Sarah felt a fierce protectiveness take root in her heart. Shadow's sudden whinny drew her attention back to the window. The horse had turned away from the approaching sirens, his focus once again drawn to the darkness beyond the ranch's boundaries. As lightning illuminated the night sky, Sarah could have sworn she saw movement at the edge of her property. A small, shadowy figure that seemed to melt away into the underbrush as quickly as it had appeared. The arrival of Sheriff Wheeler and the paramedics temporarily pushed the mysterious sighting from her mind. The baby was quickly examined, and Forrest started to combat dehydration. Tom Wheeler's weathered face was grim as he took Sarah's statement, his years of experience evident in the precise questions he asked. "You said Shadow led you there?" he asked, frowning as he made notes in his small notebook. "And he's still acting restless?" Sarah nodded, watching as the paramedics prepared to transport the baby. "He's never behaved like this before, Tom. It's like he knows something we don't." The sheriff's frown deepened as he looked out the window at the stallion, who continued to alternate between pacing and staring intently into the darkness. "Maybe he does," Tom said slowly. "I've learned not to discount animal instincts over the years. Would you be willing to go back out there with me once the sun's up? Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right." Sarah agreed, though her heart ached as she watched the ambulance pull away with its precious cargo. The paramedics had assured her the baby would be okay. She was remarkably healthy considering the circumstances of her discovery, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this night's events were far from over. As if confirming her suspicions, Shadow's urgent whinny once again pierced the night, his call carrying a note of insistence that neither Sarah nor Tom could ignore. The storm was beginning to pass, the rain reducing to a gentle patter, and in the relative quiet that followed, they both heard it. A rustling in the undergrowth, followed by what sounded like a child's muffled sob. Tom's hand instinctively moved to his weapon, but Sarah was already moving toward the door, drawn by an instinct as powerful as the one that had guided Shadow earlier that night. As she stepped onto the porch, the security light illuminated a small figure crouched beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. A child, wild-eyed and trembling, watching them with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Shadow, who had been keeping his distance from the newcomers at the house, suddenly moved with purpose toward the tree. His approach was gentle, head lowered, each step careful and measured as if approaching a frightened foe. The child didn't run. Instead, a small hand reached out to touch Shadow's nose, and in that moment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. The night that had begun with a horse's intuition was about to reveal an even deeper mystery, one that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about family, justice, and the healing power of love. As she slowly approached the child beneath the oak tree, Shadow standing guard like a sentinel between them, Sarah felt the first stirrings of what she would later recognize as destiny. A calling that had been waiting for her all alone, hidden in the darkness of a stormy Montana night. Sheriff Wheeler watched from the porch, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene unfolding before him. He'd known Sarah since she was a girl, had watched her weather the loss of her mother to cancer, her father to a heart attack, and the gradual isolation that came with choosing to maintain the ranch alone. Now, as he observed her gentle approach to the frightened child, he saw something awakening in her. A purpose that transcended the simple act of rescue. The child couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, though it was hard to tell beneath the layers of dirt and what appeared to be defensive wounds on her visible skin. Her clothes were ragged, her dark hair matted and wild, but it was her eyes that caught and held Sarah's attention. Eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain for one so young. As Sarah crouched down several feet away from the child, she felt Shadow's presence behind her like a warm wall of support. The horse's calm energy seemed to create a bubble of safety around them, and slowly, ever so slowly, the child's rigid posture began to relax. "You're safe now," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle assurance she used with frightened horses. "No one here will hurt you, I promise." The child's gaze darted between Sarah, Shadow, and the sheriff on the porch, calculating risks and escape routes with a sophistication that made Sarah's heart ache. When the girl finally spoke, her voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper. "The baby?" The question hung in the rain-washed air like a prayer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the implications began to dawn on her. "The baby is safe," she assured quickly. "We found her. She's being taken care of right now." Relief flooded the child's features, followed immediately by a fresh wave of fear. She began to tremble violently, her small body racked with shivers that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. Without thinking, Sarah opened her arms, offering rather than imposing comfort. For a long moment, the child remained frozen in place. Then, like a dam breaking, she launched herself into Sarah's embrace, her sob muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Shadow moved closer, creating a protective circle around them both, while Tom Wheeler quietly radioed for additional support, his voice pitched low to avoid disturbing the fragile sea. As Sarah held the shaking child, her mind raced with questions she knew would need answers. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was providing the safety this little one so desperately needed. She could feel the girl's heartbeat, rapid like a trapped bird's, gradually beginning to slow as exhaustion took over. "Let's get you inside," Sarah murmured, carefully gathering the child in her arms. The girl was frighteningly light, and Sarah could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her shirt. Shadow followed them to the porch, stopping only when they reached the door. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the yard, as if daring anything sinister to emerge from the shadows. Inside, Sarah settled the child on the couch, wrapping her in a clean blanket while Tom quietly made calls from the kitchen. The girl's eyes were growing heavy, though she fought against sleep with determined desperation. "It's okay to rest," Sarah assured her, smoothing back tangled hair from the child's forehead. "You're both safe now, I promise." The mention of the baby seemed to trigger something in the girl. Her eyes flew open, and she grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "They'll come looking," she whispered, fear making her voice quaver. "They always come looking." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, even as she maintained a calm exterior. "Who will come looking?" she asked gently, but the child had already succumbed to exhaustion, her grip on Sarah's hand loosening as sleep finally claimed her. Tom Wheeler appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Paramedics are on their way," he said quietly, "and I've got deputies setting up a perimeter around your property." "Sarah," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "This is bigger than finding an abandoned baby. Whatever we've stumbled into here, I've got a feeling it's just the beginning." Sarah nodded, still stroking the sleeping child's hair. Through the window, she could see Shadow maintaining his vigilant watch, his dark form a constant reminder of how this night of revelations had begun. As thunder rumbled in the distance, a reminder of the storm that had brought them to this moment, Sarah made a silent vow to the 2 young lives that had been entrusted to her care. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The night stretched on, bringing with it more questions than answers. But as Sarah sat guard over the sleeping child, listening to Shadow's occasional reassuring nickering from outside, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important journeys begin not with a choice, but with a call that cannot be ignored, even if that call comes in the form of a horse's intuition on a stormy Montana night. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky when Sarah heard vehicles approaching the ranch. Shadows warning when he preceded the sound of corridors closing, and moments later, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of the paramedics Tom had called. The child stirred restlessly but didn't wake, exhaustion keeping her locked in deep sleep. As medical professionals quietly examined the girl, Sarah stood with Tom on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a world washed clean, though evidence of the night's drama remained in the muddy tire tracks and hoof prints that marked the drive. "I've got deputies checking the landfill site," Tom said, his voice low, "and I've put in calls to neighboring counties about missing children. But Sarah," he paused, running a hand over his face, "whatever we're dealing with here, I've got a feeling it won't be as simple as finding missing persons reports." Sarah nodded, her eyes drawn to Shadow, who had finally allowed himself to rest, though his ears still swiveled attentively at every new sound. "What happens now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be one she wanted to hear. "By the book, we need to get both children into the system," Tom said carefully. "Child services will need to be involved, and given the circumstances." He trailed off as Sarah's expression hardened. "They're connected, Tom," she said firmly. "That little girl in there knows something about the baby, something that frightens her deeply. If we separate them now, we might lose our only chance to understand what's really going on." The sheriff sighed, recognizing the determination in Sarah's voice. He'd known her long enough to recognize when her mind was made up. "What are you suggesting?" "Let me keep them here," Sarah said, turning to face him fully, "at least until we know more. The ranch is secure, isolated. If someone really is looking for them, as the girl suggested, they'll be safer here than anywhere else." In Shadow, she glanced at her horse, a small smile touching her lips. "Shadow found them for a reason. I don't think his part in this is finished yet." Tom was quiet for a long moment, weighing options and regulations against his instincts and years of experience. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls, pull some strings. But Sarah, you need to understand what you're taking on here. These children could be involved in something dangerous. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah's gaze drifted to the window where she could see the sleeping child on her couch, small and vulnerable in the growing morning light. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Tom. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." Inside, the paramedics had finished their preliminary examination of the girl. Their report was troubling. Signs of prolonged malnutrition, various stages of healing bruises, and calluses that suggested she'd been living rough for some time. Despite this, they found no immediate life-threatening conditions that would require hospitalization. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself falling into a new routine. She called her neighbor, Martha, to handle the ranch's essential tasks for the day. Martha, a widow who had been friends with Sarah's father, asked no questions when Sarah mentioned a family emergency. Just promised to take care of everything. The baby was being kept at the county hospital for observation, but Tom had arranged for Sarah to visit later that day. For now, her focus was on the sleeping child who had yet to stir from her position on the couch. Shadow had finally moved from his guard post to graze in the nearby paddock, though his head still lifted at any unusual sound. It was nearly noon when the girl finally began to wake. Sarah had prepared for this moment, setting out clean clothes that might fit, left over from her sister's kids' last visit, and making sure there was food ready that wouldn't overwhelm a stomach and used to regular meals. The child's return to consciousness was immediate and alert, no gradual awakening, but rather a sudden snap to awareness that spoke of long-practiced survival instincts. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail before settling on Sarah, who sat quietly in a nearby chair. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, keeping her posture relaxed and open. "Are you hungry?" The girl's gaze moved to the kitchen where the smell of chicken soup, Sarah's mother's recipe, filled the air. She nodded slightly but made no move to get up. "Can you tell me your name?" Sarah asked, maintaining the gentle tone that seemed to put the child at ease. There was a long pause, filled only with the distant sounds of Shadow's hooves on the paddock ground and the gentle bubbling of the soup on the stove. Finally, In a voice barely above a whisper, the girl spoke. They called me 8. Sarah felt her heart constrict at the implication of that statement. Not a name, but a number. Would you like a different name? She asked carefully. The child's eyes widened slightly, as if the concept had never occurred to her. She looked down at her hands, then back at Sarah. I used to dream about being called Lucy, she admitted, the words coming out in a rush, as if she feared they might be taken back. Lucy is a beautiful name, Sarah smiled warmly. Would you like some soup, Lucy? The newly named Lucy nodded again, this time with more enthusiasm. As Sarah moved to the kitchen to prepare a bowl, she could feel the girl's eyes following her every movement. There was still fear there, but curiosity was beginning to shine through as well. The soup was a success. Lucy ate slowly but steadily, each spoonful measured and careful, like someone who had learned the hard way not to eat too quickly when food was available. As she ate, Sarah noticed her gaze repeatedly drawn to the window where Shadow could be seen grazing. That's Shadow, Sarah explained. He's the one who found you and the baby last night. At the mention of the baby, Lucy's spoon clattered against the bowl. Is she really safe? She asked, her voice urgent. They didn't find her? She's safe at the hospital, Sarah assured her quickly. No one can hurt her there. Can you tell me about her, Lucy? Is she your sister? Lucy shook her head, then hesitated. Not really, but I had to protect her. They said she was special, like me, but different, better. Her face clouded with remembered pain. They were going to take her away, to the bad place. I couldn't let them. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral despite the horror building in her chest. Who are they, Lucy? But Lucy had retreated back into herself, her eyes taking on that distant look that spoke of memories too painful to voice. She pushed the half-finished bowl of soup away and drew her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Shadow chose that moment to approach the window, his dark eyes peering in as if checking on them. Lucy's attention immediately shifted to the horse, some of the tension leaving her small frame. Would you like to meet him properly? Sarah asked, recognizing the moment for what it was, a chance to build trust. For the first time, a real smile flickered across Lucy's face. It transformed her features, revealing the child she should have been, might still become, with time and care. She nodded eagerly, uncurling from her defensive position. Sarah found some old tennis shoes that fit well enough, and together they walked out to the paddock. Shadow met them at the fence, his manner gentle as Lucy reached out a tentative hand to stroke his nose. The horse lowered his head, blowing softly against her palm, and Lucy giggled. A sound so unexpected and pure that Sarah had to blink back tears. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Tom's patrol car, kicking up dust as it came down the drive. Lucy immediately tensed, but Shadow remained calm, his presence seeming to reassure her. It's okay, Sarah said quickly. That's just Sheriff Wheeler. You remember him from last night? He's here to help us. Tom approached slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Lucy's protective stance behind Sarah, Shadow's watchful presence. The way the girl's hand remained tangled in the horse's mane as if drawing strength from the connection. Good news, he said, directing his words to Sarah but keeping his body language open and unthreatening. The baby's doing well. Doctor says she's remarkably healthy, all things considered, and I've arranged for you to have temporary emergency custody of both children, pending investigation. The relief that flooded through Sarah was immediately tempered by Lucy's reaction to the word investigation. The girl's whole body went rigid, her fingers tightening in Shadow's mane until the horse nickered softly, calling her back from whatever dark place her mind had gone. Lucy, Sarah said gently, crouching down to the child's eye level. I promise you, no one is going to take you or the baby away, but we need to understand what happened so we can keep you both safe. Can you help us with that? Lucy's gaze darted between Sarah and Tom, then up to Shadow's steady presence beside her. Finally, she gave a tiny nod. They'll be angry, she whispered. They'll come looking. They always come looking. Let them, Tom said firmly, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his service weapon. They'll find more than they bargained for this time. Sarah could see the conviction in his stance, the protectiveness that had nothing to do with official duty and everything to do with the basic human instinct to shield the innocent from harm. She felt it too, a fierce determination that whatever darkness Lucy and the baby had fled from would never touch them again. As if sensing this shift in the atmosphere, Shadow raised his head high, scanning the horizon with alert eyes. The morning sun caught his coat, turning it to liquid obsidian, a guardian cast in living shadow. Lucy's hand in his mane relaxed slightly, and Sarah could see some of the terror leaving her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. "Can we go see the baby?" Lucy asked suddenly, her voice small but steady. I need to make sure she's really okay." Sarah exchanged a glance with Tom, who nodded. "I'll escort you both to the hospital," he said. "But first, Lucy, do you think you could tell us just one thing? Does the baby have a name?" Lucy's face softened as she looked up at them. "Hope," she said quietly. "I heard them say her real name was supposed to be XJ13, but I've been calling her Hope, because that's what she is." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. Even in the midst of whatever horror these children had escaped, Lucy had found the strength not only to save the baby, but to give her a name that spoke of future possibilities rather than past pain. "Hope is perfect," she managed to say, reaching out slowly to take Lucy's free hand. The girl allowed the contact, her small fingers curling trustingly around Sarah's. "Should we go see her?" Lucy nodded, but before they could move toward Tom's car, Shadow suddenly tensed, his ears swiveling toward the distant tree line. A moment later, they all heard it, the distinctive sound of an approaching helicopter, growing louder by the second. Tom's hand moved to his radio even as Sarah instinctively pulled Lucy closer. The girl's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the increasing roar from above. "They found us." The morning that had seemed so full of promise suddenly turned dark with menace, but as Sarah looked down at the trembling child beside her, she felt her determination hardened into something unbreakable. Whatever was coming, whoever was in that helicopter, they would find more than just two lost children. They would find a family ready to fight for its own. Shadow's challenging when he cut through the air like a battle cry, and Sarah straightened to her full height, one hand still holding Lucy's, the other reaching for her phone to make an urgent call. The true test of her promise to protect these children was about to begin, and she would not be found wanting.